What happens when the invisible overweight waitress at New York's most elite restaurant accidentally intercepts a deadly misunderstanding between a ruthless mob boss and his terrifying Sicilian father? A single flawlessly pronounced sentence in an ancient dialect that made a room full of millionaires and murderers drop their forks. Penelope Hayes was used to being invisible, which was ironic considering she took up more space than anyone else in the room. At 25 years old and proudly wearing a size 22, Penelope was a soft, heavy-set woman in a world that worshipped sharp angles and hollow cheekbones. She worked as a server at Il Sogno Bianco, an ultra-exclusive Michelin-starred Italian restaurant located on East 63rd Street in Manhattan. It was the kind of place where reservations were booked 6 months in advance, where a plate of truffle pasta cost more than a car payment, and where the waitstaff were exclusively hired from a pool of struggling fashion models. Except for Penelope. She had been hired purely by accident during a desperate staffing shortage 3 years ago, and she only survived the purges of the superficial general manager, Arthur Pendleton, because she was arguably the hardest working employee in the building. While the size 0 waitresses were busy checking their makeup in the reflection of the polished silver platters, Penelope was the one hauling 40-pound crates of San Marzano tomatoes from the delivery trucks, memorizing the convoluted ever-changing wine lists, and balancing 3 massive trays of scalding hot osso buco on her thick forearms without breaking a sweat. But tonight her competence didn't matter. Tonight Arthur wanted her hidden. "Penelope, I need you to understand the gravity of this evening," Arthur hissed, his thin, reedy voice echoing in the stainless steel prep kitchen. He adjusted his bespoke tie, his eyes darting nervously toward the swinging dining room doors. "The entire main floor has been bought out. We are hosting the Conti family. Do you understand what that means?" "No, of course you don't." Penelope wiped her brow with the back of her wrist, her customized extra-large apron pulled tight across her wide hips. "I know who Alessandro Conti is, Arthur. Half of the Upper East Side knows who he is. Alessandro Conti wasn't just a VIP. He was the undisputed whisper-networked head of the Cosa Nostra's new generation on the eastern seaboard. Operating out of a fortress-like penthouse on Park Avenue, Alessandro was a modern ghost, ruthless Yale-educated and terrifyingly untouchable. But tonight wasn't just about Alessandro. It's not just him. Arthur snapped, his pale face glistening with cold sweat. His father is flying in from Palermo. Don Vincenzo Conti, the old man. He is notoriously traditional. He despises American culture. He despises modern excess. And he certainly despises. Arthur's gaze dragged up and down Penelope's plush, heavy figure, his lip curling slightly. "Well, let's just say we need to present a certain aesthetic tonight. Sleek, elegant, unobtrusive. I cannot afford to have you waddling between the tight tables and knocking over a bottle of the Tenuta dell'Onelaya Maceto with your hips." Penelope bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. The insult stung, a hot flare of humiliation radiating through her thick chest, but she swallowed it down. She needed the tips from the back house pool to pay her rent. "Understood, Arthur. I'll stay in the service alley and run the staging tables. Chloe and the others can take the floor." "Good girl," Arthur breathed, already turning away. "Stay out of sight." Penelope retreated to the shadows of the service corridor, leaning her heavy frame against the cool brick wall. She closed her eyes and let the familiar, comforting sounds of the kitchen wash over her. She might not look like an Italian runway model, but she knew this world better than any of them. Penelope wasn't Italian by blood, but she had been raised in a cramped, humid apartment in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, right next door to Signora Agata. Agata was a fierce, formidable woman from Castellammare del Golfo, a small, ancient town in Sicily, while Penelope's single mother worked triple shifts at a diner Agatha had essentially raised the chubby, quiet little girl. But Agatha had adamantly refused to learn English. Instead, she had spoken to Penelope exclusively in a heavy, archaic, Palermitano-Sicilian dialect. It wasn't the sanitized, romanticized Italian taught in college courses. It was a guttural, melodic, street-level language full of old-world idioms, sharp consonants, and deep cultural nuances. By the time Penelope was 10, she was completely fluent. She could curse like a Sicilian sailor, pray like a Sicilian grandmother, and cook like an absolute master. She rubbed her thick thighs, feeling the ache of a long shift already setting in. Out on the floor, the atmosphere was growing tighter than a piano wire. The lights had been dimmed. The jazz music had been turned down to a low, mournful hum. The regular patrons had been cleared out hours ago. At exactly 8 p.m., the heavy mahogany front doors of Il Sogno Bianco swung open, and the temperature in the restaurant seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. From her hidden vantage point behind the sheer velvet curtains of the service station, Penelope watched them enter. First came the security. 4 men built like brick walls, wearing sharply tailored black suits that couldn't quite hide the bulges of their shoulder holsters. They fanned out across the empty dining room, their eyes scanning the corners, the exits, and the terrified waitstaff. Then Alessandro Conti walked in. He was breathtakingly lethal. Mid-30s, tall and lean, dressed in a charcoal Brioni suit that clung to his broad shoulders. His hair was dark and slicked back, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, but it was his eyes that made Penelope's breath catch in her throat. They were a dead, fathomless black. He moved with the terrifying grace of a predator that knew it had no natural enemies, but the air of the room didn't truly snap until the man behind him stepped over the threshold. Don Vincenzo Conti. The old man was shorter than his son, broad-chested, and built like a weathered oak tree. He leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane topped with a silver wolf's head, but there was nothing frail about him. He wore a heavy wool suit, despite the warm New York evening, a fedora resting in his gnarled hands. His face was a map of deep scars and sun-baked wrinkles, and his eyes, the exact same black as Alessandro's, burned with an ancient, uncompromising fury. The silence in the restaurant was absolute. The waitstaff stood at attention, like terrified soldiers. Arthur was trembling so violently, his clipboard was rattling against his hip. Alessandro gestured to the prime corner booth. "Padre, per favore," he murmured, his Italian clipped and formal. Vincenzo didn't say a word. He limped to the booth, his cane striking the marble floor with heavy, ominous thwacks. He sat down, waving away the trembling hands of Chloe, the size 0 waitress, who was attempting to drape a linen napkin across his lap. "Non toccarmi," Vincenzo growled. "Do not touch me." Chloe gasped, stepping back so fast she nearly tripped over her own heels. Penelope winced from the shadows. This was going to be a disaster. The dinner began, and it was a masterclass in slow-motion agony. Penelope watched as Alessandro attempted to broker what looked like a high-stakes peace treaty with his father. Between them sat an older, nervous-looking man in a cheap suit, a translator. It became immediately apparent that Vincenzo refused to speak English, and he also refused to speak standard Italian. He was speaking entirely in thick, rapid-fire, localized Sicilian dialect. The translator was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. He was missing the nuances. Penelope could hear it from 20 feet away. Vincenzo was speaking in metaphors utilizing old Castellammarese idioms that the translator was butchering into literal, nonsensical English. Alessandro was growing visibly irritated. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, the heavy gold of his Patek Philippe watch, catching the dim light. "Tell him," Alessandro snapped at the translator, "that the territory in the Bronx is secure. We don't need to send a message to the Russians. It's handled." The translator turned to Vincenzo, and stammered out the translation in broken formal Italian. Vincenzo's eyes narrowed. His gnarled hands gripped the silver wolf's head of his cane. He leaned forward, ignoring the translator entirely, and locked eyes with his son. Suddenly Vincenzo erupted. His voice boomed through the silent restaurant, a harsh, guttural roar of pure Sicilian rage. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the crystal wine glasses rattle. The bodyguards in the room instantly stiffened their hands, hovering inches from their lapels. "You bring me to this plastic box," Vincenzo roared in his native tongue, the dialect rolling off his tongue like thunder. "You feed me grass and water, surrounded by these walking skeletons who shake like wet dogs. You surround yourself with fools who cannot even speak the mother tongue, and you tell me you have the wolves under control. You are a boy playing in the mud. Alessandro, you have forgotten the blood of the island." The translator whimpered. Alessandro leaned forward, his face a mask of cold fury. "What did he say?" Alessandro demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "Translate it, exactly." The translator stammered, his face pale. He says you are a boy, and that the restaurant is bad." It was the wrong thing to say. It was a pathetic, watered-down summary of a deeply poetic, deeply insulting reprimand. Vincenzo knew the translator had failed. The old man scoffed in disgust, grabbing his cane. He began to push himself up from the table. Penelope knew exactly what this meant. If Vincenzo walked out of this restaurant, it wasn't just a ruined dinner. It was a declaration of war. It was a father disowning his son's empire. The tension in the room was so thick, it was suffocating. Arthur was hyperventilating in the corner. Chloe was silently crying. The bodyguards were tensing for violence. Penelope didn't think. If she had thought about it, the sheer terror of the situation would have kept her glued to the brick wall. But her body moved on instinct, fueled by years of watching Signora Agata storm around the kitchen, demanding respect. She pushed her way through the velvet curtains. Her heavy black shoes clicked against the marble floor. She didn't try to shrink herself. She didn't try to hide her wide hips or her thick arms. She walked with the solid, grounded weight of a woman who knew exactly how to take up space. As she approached the table, Arthur's eyes widened in absolute horror. "Stop," he mouthed silently, looking like he was about to faint. One of the bodyguards stepped directly into Penelope's path, pressing a massive hand against her collarbone to stop her. "Back off, sweetheart," the guard growled. Penelope didn't even flinch. She looked the guard dead in the eye, her soft, round face set in stone. She gently but firmly swatted his massive hand away from her chest. The guard was so shocked by the sheer audacity of the chubby waitress that he actually stepped aside. Penelope stopped 2 feet away from the Conti table. Alessandro's head snapped toward her, his black eyes slicing into her like knives. Vincenzo, halfway out of his seat, paused, staring down his nose at the large woman in the stained apron who had dared to interrupt them. The entire restaurant held its breath. You could have heard a pin drop. Penelope squared her shoulders, folded her hands over her large stomach, looked directly into the terrifying eyes of Don Vincenzo, and opened her mouth. "Con rispetto, Don Vincenzo." Penelope began her voice, carrying a rich, resonant timbre that cut through the tension like a warm knife through butter. She didn't speak in standard Italian. She bypassed it entirely. She dropped her voice into the exact rhythmic, guttural Palermitano dialect that had echoed through the halls of her childhood. "The wolves in the north may be loud," Penelope said, in flawless ancient Sicilian, utilizing the exact idiom he had just used. "But a wise shepherd knows that the loudest wolves are the ones starving in the winter. Your son has built a high wall. The meat on this table is cooked with the fire of the old country, even if the plates look new. Sit down, Patre. Do not let the cold air in to spite the warmth of the house." For 3 excruciating seconds, nobody breathed. The translator stared at Penelope with his jaw literally hanging open. Arthur looked like he was having a coronary event behind the bar. Alessandro Conti froze. His dark, deadly eyes slowly dragged away from his father and locked onto Penelope. He looked at her soft, full face, her messy bun, her wide waist, and the absolute lack of fear in her posture. A strange, dangerous spark ignited in his pitch-black eyes. Vincenzo Conti stood perfectly still. The old mob boss stared at the large, unapologetic American woman who had just scolded him using the dialect of his great-grandfather. He looked at her thick, capable hands. He looked at the quiet fire in her eyes. Slowly the tension drained from Vincenzo's shoulders. The deep wrinkles around his eyes crinkled. A low, rumbling chuckle started deep in Vincenzo's chest building, until the terrifying Mafia Don was throwing his head back and laughing a loud, booming sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "Minchia!" Vincenzo roared affectionately, slamming his cane onto the floor. He pointed a thick, rings-covered finger at Penelope. "A woman who eats, a woman who speaks. Finally, my son, you show me someone in this city who actually has some blood in her veins." Vincenzo sank back into his booth, leaning heavily against the leather, a massive grin splitting his scarred face. He waved his hand at the trembling translator. "Get this useless piece of paper out of my sight," Vincenzo commanded in dialect. "The girl translates tonight, and she brings the wine. I will not be served by another skeleton." Alessandro gestured lazily with 2 fingers. Within seconds, the bodyguards had grabbed the terrified translator by the arm and escorted him out of the restaurant. Alessandro leaned back in his seat, his gaze returning to Penelope. It wasn't the dismissive, disgusted look Arthur gave her. It was a look of intense, consuming calculation. He looked at her heavy curves like he was seeing something priceless that had been hidden in plain sight. "Well," Alessandro murmured, his voice, a deep, velvety baritone that sent a sudden, unwanted shiver down Penelope's thick spine. "It seems my father has made a request." He tilted his head, his dark eyes tracing the flush of pink that was rising in Penelope's chubby cheeks. "What is your name, sweetheart?" "Penelope," she said, her voice steady, refusing to let him see how fast her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Penelope." Alessandro tasted the name, a slow, dangerous smirk curling the corner of his mouth. "Pull up a chair, Penelope. You're having dinner with us." Penelope sat. She didn't perch nervously on the edge of the plush leather booth like the other waitresses would have. She settled her heavy hips deeply into the seat, letting her weight ground her. Across from her, Alessandro Conti watched her every move, his dark eyes tracking the slide of her thick thighs and the confident set of her broad shoulders. It was an intense, unblinking stare that made her skin run hot, but she refused to look away. "Eat," Don Vincenzo commanded, snapping his fingers at the kitchen doors. Within minutes, the terrified kitchen staff, led by a pale, trembling Arthur, wheeled out a feast that defied Il Sogno Bianco's usual minimalist aesthetic. There were massive, steaming platters of pappardelle al cinghiale, thick cuts of bistecca alla fiorentina, dripping with rosemary butter and roasted marrow bones. Vincenzo bypassed the delicate $500 bottles of Pinot Noir Arthur had selected, instead demanding Penelope choose the wine. She immediately ordered 3 bottles of Tenuta San Guido Sassicaia 2016, a bold, heavy Super Tuscan that could punch through the rich fat of the meal. As they ate, the real meeting began. Penelope found herself acting as the bridge between 2 generations of ruthless power. She translated Alessandro's cold, calculated business metrics into the poetic, honor-bound dialect Vincenzo required. She spoke of the ports in Red Hook, the shipment delays caused by the longshoremen unions, and the brewing tension with the Russo family specifically a brutal Brooklyn underboss named Jimmy Blue Eyes. Russo, a real-life terror who had been encroaching on Conti territory near the Gowanus Canal. Through it all, Penelope didn't just translate. She ate. She didn't pick at her food. She dragged thick cuts of crusty bread through the bone marrow, relishing the rich flavors, washing it down with generous swallows of the heavy red wine. Alessandro was mesmerized. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by women who treated food like poison, fragile socialites, who starved themselves to fit into sample sizes, hollowed out, and constantly anxious. But Penelope was lush. She was a woman of undeniable substance, utterly unapologetic about her size, her appetite, or her intelligence. Every time she laughed at one of Vincenzo's dark jokes, her soft, generous breasts pressed against the bodice of her uniform, and Alessandro's gaze darkened with naked, predatory hunger. "You have a good head on your shoulders, Piccola," Vincenzo said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "You understand the old ways, not like these modern fools who think power is a spreadsheet. Power is blood. Power is territory. Power is also knowing when the wind shifts, Don Vincenzo," Penelope replied smoothly in Sicilian, meeting his gaze. "A strong tree bends in a hurricane, a rigid one snaps." Vincenzo's eyes widened, and then he slammed his hand on the table in pure delight. "Alessandro," he barked in standard Italian, looking at his son, "if you do not marry this woman, I will adopt her and give her your seat at the table." Alessandro leaned closer to Penelope, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble that vibrated right through her chest. "I have no intention of letting her go anywhere, Padre." Before Penelope could process the sheer gravity of that statement, the heavy oak front doors of the restaurant exploded. The sound was deafening, a concussive blast of shattering glass and splintering wood that blew the massive doors completely off their hinges. The serene jazz music playing over the speakers was instantly drowned out by the harsh, mechanical roar of automatic gunfire. "Get down!" Alessandro roared, overturning the massive oak table with a violent heave, sending crystal wine glasses and plates of steak crashing to the marble floor. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Penelope hit the floor hard, the breath knocking out of her lungs. Above her, the Conti bodyguards had already drawn their weapons, returning fire toward the entrance. Through the smoke and flying plaster, Penelope saw the attackers, 5 men wearing heavy tactical gear, their faces covered with ski masks. Jimmy Russo's men. They had tracked Vincenzo from the airport. Arthur screamed from the bar, diving behind the espresso machine. Chloe and the other waitstaff were paralyzed, shrieking in terror, as bullets shredded the expensive Italian upholstery and shattered the crystal chandeliers, sending showers of glass raining down on them. "Padre!" Alessandro yelled, firing his Sig Sauer blindly over the edge of the overturned table. Vincenzo was struggling. The old man's bad leg had buckled when the table flipped, and he was pinned dangerously close to the exposed aisle. A bullet zipped through the air, tearing a chunk of leather out of the booth, mere inches from the Don's head. Penelope didn't hesitate. Adrenaline flooded her system, entirely overriding her fear. While the thin, delicate waitstaff cowered and screamed, Penelope's size and strength became her greatest weapon. She crawled fast, her thick thighs pushing off the slick marble floor. She reached Vincenzo, grabbing the collar of his heavy wool suit. "Hold on to me!" she yelled in dialect over the deafening roar of gunfire. With a massive surge of strength, Penelope hauled the heavy, broad-chested mob boss backward. She planted her sturdy boots against the floor and dragged him across the aisle, pulling him behind the solid, bulletproof marble of the restaurant's central bar. She threw her own soft, heavy body over his, shielding him from the raining debris and ricocheting bullets. "I have him!" Penelope screamed to Alessandro. Alessandro snapped his head toward her. Seeing his father safely behind the thick marble, shielded by Penelope's fierce protective embrace, something feral and absolute locked into place behind his dead black eyes. He wasn't just fighting for his father anymore. He was fighting for her. Alessandro moved. He was terrifying a ghost in a bespoke suit. He vaulted over the overturned table, moving with lethal precision, taking out two of the masked gunmen with flawless headshots before they even realized he had broken cover. His bodyguards advanced a coordinated wave of violence that swept the remaining attackers out into the street. Within 90 seconds it was over. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the whimpering of the waitstaff and the hiss of a ruptured espresso machine. "Clear!" one of the bodyguards shouted from the shattered entryway. Penelope slowly rolled off Vincenzo, her chest heaving, her hands trembling as the adrenaline began to recede. She looked down at the old Don. "Are you okay?" she gasped. Vincenzo looked up at her, his dark eyes wide. Slowly he reached up and patted her soft, flushed cheek. "I am alive," he rasped, "because of a woman with hips wide enough to carry the weight of the world." He chuckled a rough, dusty sound. "You are a lioness." Heavy footsteps crunched over the broken glass. Alessandro rounded the bar, his suit dusted with white plaster, his gun still loosely gripped in his right hand. He looked down at his father, ensuring he was unharmed before his terrifying gaze locked entirely onto Penelope. He reached down his large, blood-spattered hand, gripping her thick forearm. He pulled her to her feet with effortless strength, hauling her plush, heavy body flush against his hard chest. "You're bleeding," Alessandro murmured, his voice tight. He reached up his thumb, gently swiping a small cut on her cheekbone caused by flying glass. His touch was shockingly tender, completely at odds with the violence surrounding them. "It's just a scratch," Penelope breathed, looking up into his fathomless black eyes. She could feel the rapid, heavy thud of his heart against her breasts. Mr. Conti, Arthur Pendleton, crawled out from beneath the far end of the bar. His designer suit ruined his hair, a frantic mess. He looked at the shattered restaurant, the blood on the floor, and the dead men in the entryway. "My restaurant," Arthur wailed, clutching his head. "The police! The insurance! You people are animals! And you—" Arthur pointed a shaking, accusatory finger at Penelope. "You're fired. I told you to stay out of sight, you stupid fat cow. You brought them over here." The air in the room instantly dropped below freezing. Alessandro slowly turned his head to look at Arthur. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his weapon. He simply stared at the general manager with a look of such absolute predatory malice that Arthur immediately stopped speaking, the blood draining completely from his face. "What did you call her?" Alessandro asked, his voice a soft, silken whisper that carried across the ruined dining room. Arthur swallowed hard, backing up against the wall. I just meant—" Alessandro released Penelope, taking 2 slow, deliberate steps toward Arthur. "This restaurant is currently valued at $4.2 million, Alessandro stated coldly. "As of this exact second, I am buying it for 5. My lawyers will send the paperwork to your widow if you ever speak to my woman like that again. Get out of my sight." Arthur didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled over the broken glass and sprinted out the back kitchen doors, leaving his clipboard and his dignity behind. Alessandro turned back to Penelope. The room was a disaster zone, but he looked at her as if they were the only 2 people on Earth. He stepped into her space, his hands coming to rest on her wide hips, his long fingers gripping her soft curves possessively. "My father is returning to Sicily tomorrow," Alessandro said, his voice dropping an octave, meant only for her ears. "He is leaving the eastern seaboard entirely in my control. He gave me his blessing, not because of my ledgers or my soldiers." Alessandro leaned down, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear, sending a hot thrill straight down Penelope's spine. "He gave it to me because he saw the woman standing beside me." Penelope's breath hitched. "Alessandro, I'm a waitress. I live in a walk-up in Bensonhurst. You were a waitress? Alessandro corrected, pulling her heavy body flush against his, letting her feel the undeniable physical evidence of his desire. Now you own this restaurant, and tomorrow I'm moving you into the penthouse. You're done hiding in the shadows, Penelope. You were built to rule. He didn't wait for her to argue. Alessandro brought his mouth down on hers, kissing her with a fierce, consuming heat that tasted like red wine danger and absolute devotion. Penelope melted into him, wrapping her thick arms around his broad shoulders, kissing the Mafia boss back with all the Sicilian fire she had kept hidden her entire life. From the floor behind them, Don Vincenzo Conti leaned against the bar, watching the two of them with a satisfied grin. He raised a miraculously unbroken glass of Sassicaia toward the ceiling. "Salute," the old man whispered. What an absolutely explosive ending. Penelope went from hiding her curves in the back of the kitchen to saving a Mafia don's life and claiming the heart of New York's most dangerous mob boss. If you loved seeing a fierce, curvy heroine get the respect, power, and passionate romance she deserves, make sure you hit that like button, share this incredible story with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, pulse-pounding romance dramas.